ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and citizens concerned with the future of our world. Thank you for joining me today. For months, I have been warning that a profound shift was approaching, a convergence of crises and transformations that would redefine the course of our politics, our economy, and our society. I told you something was coming, and now it's here. The moment has arrived, not as a sudden surprise, but as the inevitable consequence of choices made, of warnings ignored, and of truths overlooked. The economy, my friends, is the bedrock of our society, and yet it is precisely there where the cracks have been forming for decades. When I warned that something was coming, I was pointing directly at the long, deliberate erosion of economic fairness in the United States. For far too long, economic policy has been designed not for the many, but for the few. Wall Street executives, multinational corporations, and political insiders have benefited from a system skewed toward short-term profits, while the working and middle classes have been left carrying the burden of rising costs, stagnant wages, and disappearing opportunities. And now the inevitable has arrived. The fragile scaffolding of this model is buckling, and the ordinary citizen is feeling the weight of an economic storm that is no longer in the distance. It is here, pressing down on every household, every community, and every corner of this nation. Look closely at the reality people are living today. Inflation is not just a statistic, it is a family in Michigan forced to decide between paying the rent and buying groceries. It is a young worker in Texas watching their paycheck evaporate before it even clears the bank. It is retirees in Florida who work their entire lives only to discover that their pensions are insufficient against the relentless rise of living costs. This is not an abstract debate. It is the everyday struggle of millions of Americans. For years, policymakers ignored the warning signs, treating inequality as a byproduct rather than a threat. They assured the public that growth at the top would eventually trickle down. But let us be honest, it never trickled down. Instead, it pooled at the top, creating billionaires on one end and desperation on the other. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that the vulnerabilities are structural. We have an economy built on debt, fueled consumption, on global supply chains stretched to breaking points, and on industries that prioritize shareholder returns over community resilience. One shock after another, whether it be a pandemic, a war, or climate disaster, has shown us just how brittle this model really is. And when these shocks come, as they inevitably do, it is not the wealthy who bear the brunt, but the single mother balancing two jobs, the small business owner trying to keep the lights on, the student already drowning in loans. The inequality is not only economic, it is moral. It asks those with the least to pay the highest price. The truth is, this economic crisis is not a matter of bad luck. It is a matter of bad choices. Choices made to deregulate financial markets, to slash taxes for the wealthy, to weaken labor protections, to underfund education and healthcare, to allow corporations to offshore jobs without accountability. These decisions were not accidents. They were deliberate, and they produced exactly the outcomes we now face. And while leaders distracted the public with promises of endless prosperity, I warned that such imbalance cannot last forever. You cannot hollow out the middle class and expect a society to remain stable. You cannot treat workers as disposable and expect communities to thrive. The bill has come due, and the storm I cautioned against is no longer approaching. It is upon us. Yet, in every crisis, there is also a test. The test is not only economic, but political and moral. Will we finally recognize that an economy cannot survive when it leaves half its citizens behind? Will we muster the courage to invest in people instead of only in markets? Will we choose to rebuild an economy based on fairness, sustainability, and resilience? Or will we continue down the same road of short-term greed and long-term decline? The stakes could not be higher, because this is not simply about numbers on a spreadsheet. It is about the dignity of work, the stability of families, and the future of democracy itself. I told you something was coming, and now you can see it in the anxious eyes of parents, in the empty storefronts on main streets across America, in the quiet resignation of those who feel they no longer have a stake in this country's promise. The challenge before us is enormous, but so too is the opportunity to chart a new path, because an economy built on fairness, on investment in human potential, and on a recognition that prosperity must be shared, that is not only possible, it is necessary. The storm is here, and it demands action. The only question is whether we will meet it with courage, or whether we will allow inequality to continue corroding the foundations of our society until nothing is left to hold us together. When I warned that something was coming, I was not speaking only of domestic challenges, but of the tectonic shifts in global power that are reshaping the international order. We now live in a world where the era of unquestioned American dominance is no longer sustainable, and yet our leaders cling to outdated illusions of control. The geopolitical landscape is not static, it is fluid, volatile, and increasingly dangerous. What we are witnessing is not the rise of one rival power, but the fragmentation of a system that for decades rested on American led institutions and alliances. That world has ended, and the new one taking shape is filled with competition, mistrust, and confrontation. The something I cautioned about has arrived, and its name is a shifting balance of power that could determine whether this century is marked by cooperation or conflict. Look at the dynamics unfolding before our eyes. China is no longer a rising power. It has risen. Its economy, its technological ambitions, and its global influence now rival those of the United States. Russia, despite its economic weaknesses, has leveraged military force, energy politics, and strategic partnerships to assert itself on the global stage. Meanwhile, the global South, from Latin America to Africa to Southeast Asia, has grown tired of a world order that treats them as junior partners rather than equal stakeholders. These regions are forging their own alliances, building new institutions, and demanding a seat at the table. The multipolar world I spoke of is not a distant possibility. It is the reality unfolding in real time. Yet the response from Washington has too often been one of resistance rather than adaptation. Instead of adjusting to a world where cooperation is essential, U.S. foreign policy has leaned on confrontation. Sanctions, military posturing, and proxy conflicts. We see this in the tense standoff with China over trade, technology, and Taiwan. We see it in the escalation with Russia over Ukraine. We see it in the weakening of long standing alliances where trust is eroded by unilateralism and inconsistency. I warned that if the United States continued to pursue dominance instead of partnership, it would face a dangerous backlash. That backlash is here. What we are witnessing is the unraveling of a global order built on trust, replaced by one defined by suspicion and rivalry. This is not merely a geopolitical chess game, it has profound consequences for every nation and every citizen. A fractured world order means disrupted supply chains, rising energy costs, new arms races, and the constant threat of conflict. It means that global problems, climate change, pandemics, poverty, go unresolved because the great powers are too busy competing to cooperate. The tragedy is that we know what cooperation can achieve. We saw it in the post World War II era when international institutions were created to prevent global catastrophe. But instead of strengthening those institutions for a new era, we are allowing them to weaken under the pressure of nationalism and great power rivalry. And so the hook is this: the world is not drifting by accident. It is being driven by deliberate choices. The choice to frame China not as a competitor, but as an enemy, the choice to escalate rather than negotiate, the choice to pursue military dominance at the expense of diplomatic creativity. These are choices that are closing doors to cooperation and opening pathways to conflict. And history teaches us something chilling: when great powers refuse to adapt to a changing world, they do not preserve stability. They invite disaster. I told you this shift was coming, and now you see it in the headlines, in the broken supply chains, in the growing unease that war could erupt not on the margins, but at the very heart of the global system. The power shift is not a problem to be wished away. It is a reality to be managed with vision and courage. The nations of the world are demanding a new deal, one based not on hegemony, but on fairness, not on domination, but on respect. Whether the United States can rise to that challenge will determine not only our security, but the future of global peace. The storm of geopolitical change is here, and the question is whether we will navigate it wisely or allow it to pull us into an era of endless conflict. When I spoke months ago about the looming reality of climate change, I was not making an abstract prediction. I was pointing to the visible signs that our world was heading toward a crisis point, one that would no longer be confined to scientific reports or policy debates. That moment has arrived. and it is no longer possible to deny it. The climate emergency is not a far off threat. It is here, manifesting in floods that wipe out entire communities, in wildfires that turn cities into ash, in heat waves that make outdoor work nearly impossible, and in storms that strike with a frequency and intensity that once seemed unimaginable. I told you something was coming, and now the daily news cycle itself has become a litany of climate disasters proving the warnings true. The undeniable truth is that the planet has entered a period of profound instability. Ice sheets are melting faster than predicted, oceans are warming, and biodiversity is collapsing at an alarming rate. These are not isolated events, they are interconnected signals of a system in distress. Every year, the damages mount, not just in the form of lost ecosystems, but in billions of dollars in economic costs, in displaced families, and in lives cut short. Climate instability has become a multiplier of crises, amplifying food shortages, triggering mass migration, and fueling political unrest. The world is now learning in real time that you cannot separate environmental health from economic health or climate stability from global security. Yet, despite the clarity of the evidence, our collective response remains dangerously inadequate. Leaders speak in lofty terms about their commitments to net zero emissions, but the reality is that fossil fuel subsidies remain entrenched. Emissions are still rising, and political will too often collapses under pressure from powerful lobbies. When the smoke clears from a wildfire or the floodwaters recede, there are always promises of action, uh, yet the cycle of inaction continues. This gap between rhetoric and reality is not just negligence, it is betrayal. It is the deliberate postponement of decisions that can no longer be delayed. I warned that the longer we waited, the harsher the reckoning would be, and now that reckoning is visible in every scorched forest and every flooded street. The urgency of this moment is not only about preventing catastrophe, it is about seizing the opportunity to transform. Renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, resilient infrastructure, these are not distant dreams. They are achievable realities that can create jobs, improve public health, and stabilize societies. The hook, however, is that time is the one resource we do not have in abundance. Every year of delay makes the transition more costly, more disruptive, and more dangerous. The window for effective action is narrowing, and yet the forces of denial and delay remain strong. Fossil fuel interests still command influence, and too many governments still treat climate as an optional issue rather than the defining challenge of our era. This is not only a technical issue of carbon and kilowatts, it is a moral issue. It is about justice between generations, between nations, between those who have caused the damage and those who suffer the consequences. Oh, the poorest regions of the world, which contributed least to the problem, are bearing the heaviest burdens. Entire island nations face the possibility of extinction under rising seas. Farmers in Africa see crops fail year after year, while wealthier nations debate incremental targets. The inequity is staggering on and it is corrosive to the bonds of international trust. I told you something was coming, and now it is visible in the parched fields, the burning forests, the displaced families seeking refuge from unlivable conditions. The climate emergency is here, demanding not only acknowledgement, but decisive action. The future of our economies, our politics, and our very survival depends on whether we treat this crisis with the urgency it deserves. This is no longer a question of if or when. It is a question of how we respond now in this moment. And make no mistake, the eyes of history will judge us by the choices we make today. When I cautioned that something was coming, I was not speaking only of external threats like climate disruption or global power shifts. I was also pointing to an internal unraveling, a slow corrosion of trust that has now reached a breaking point. Democracy in America, and indeed in much of the world, is under extraordinary strain. What once felt stable and enduring is now fragile. Institutions that were built to embody integrity and fairness are increasingly viewed with suspicion, even contempt. The warning signs have been flashing for years: declining voter confidence, partisan warfare, the rise of disinformation, and the erosion of accountability. I told you this moment would come if truth and transparency were consistently sacrificed for partisan gain. And now here it is, an undeniable crisis in the very heart of democratic governance. Walk through the country and you will see it in people's eyes. Many no longer believe their voices matter. They feel elections are manipulated, debates are meaningless, and leaders are disconnected from their daily struggles. This disillusionment is not born of apathy. It is the result of repeated betrayal. Promises made, promises broken year after year. Policies shaped not by the public interest, but by donors, lobbyists, and entrenched elites. When people look at Washington, they no longer see a system that represents them. They see a stage where power and money dictate outcomes. The result is not just cynicism, but alienation, a dangerous widening gap between citizens and the institutions meant to serve them. The role of disinformation in this decay cannot be overstated. In an age where lies spread faster than truth, where algorithms amplify outrage over reason, the public square has become poisoned. Entire communities live in parallel realities, consuming different sets of facts, and as a result, trust in basic truth itself is collapsing. When citizens cannot agree on what is real, democracy cannot function. It becomes not a system of debate and compromise, but a battlefield of tribal identities. I warned that the deliberate weaponization of disinformation by politicians, by foreign actors, by profiteering media would corrode the very foundation of our democracy. Today, we see the consequences in polarized communities, in violent rhetoric, and in the sense that the very fabric of society is being pulled apart thread by thread. This erosion of democracy is not only a domestic issue, it reverberates globally. When America falters, authoritarian regimes take note. They point to dysfunction in Washington as proof that democracy is a failed model. They argue that strongmen provide stability where free societies produce only chaos. This is a dangerous narrative, and it gains traction each time our institutions appear paralyzed, each time our leaders put personal ambition above the common good. The hook here is clear: democracy is not lost in a single dramatic collapse. It is lost slowly through neglect, through cynicism, through the normalization of corruption and dishonesty. Yet this is not only about politics at the highest level. It is about the erosion of civic culture itself. Fewer people engage in meaningful dialogue across differences. Communities fracture along partisan lines. Trust in local institutions, from schools to courts, diminishes. What we are left with is not a cohesive society, but a fragmented one, vulnerable to manipulation and incapable of collective action. That vulnerability is exploited every day by domestic actors seeking to consolidate power and by foreign powers eager to see America weakened from within. I told you this unraveling was coming if we continued to abandon truth, and now we see its full effect in the storm of mistrust that engulfs us. The challenge is immense, but so too is the responsibility. If democracy is to survive, it cannot simply be defended at the ballot box. It must be rebuilt in the hearts of citizens. It requires honesty from leaders, accountability from institutions, and a renewed commitment from people themselves to demand integrity and reject division. The stakes are clear. If we do not act, the slow erosion will become collapse. And history has shown us that once lost, democracy is far harder to rebuild than it is to preserve. When I warned that something was coming, I spoke also of the weakening of the very institutions that have long held the international system together. Institutions such as the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization were built on the premise that global cooperation could prevent catastrophe and foster prosperity. They were designed after world wars to ensure that humanity would not stumble again into chaos and destruction. But today, these institutions are under siege. Their authority is questioned, their effectiveness diminished, and their credibility undermined. The system that once provided stability is now strained at the very moment when humanity needs it most. I told you this unraveling would happen if nations pursued narrow self-interest over shared responsibility, and now it is here in plain sight with dangerous consequences. Consider the United Nations, once a forum for dialogue and peacekeeping. It has become paralyzed by vetoes and power struggles. The Security Council, which was created to safeguard peace, is often gridlocked by the very nations responsible for global conflicts. The General Assembly, meant to embody the collective will of humanity, too often becomes a stage for empty rhetoric. This paralysis has a cost. Wars rage on, humanitarian crises deepen, and accountability vanishes. People around the world look at the UN and wonder, if this institution cannot prevent suffering, what is it for? The erosion of trust in such a cornerstone body is not just symbolic, it is destabilizing the fabric of international law itself. The World Bank and the IMF, designed to promote development and stability, are increasingly viewed as instruments of Western power rather than impartial institutions. Developing nations feel that their voices are sidelined, their priorities ignored, and their futures dictated by conditions imposed from outside. As a result, new financial structures are emerging, such as the BRICS Bank, as alternatives to the traditional order. This shift signals more than just frustration. It reflects a world where old institutions no longer carry the legitimacy required to command global trust. The something I spoke of is visible here, the splintering of global governance into competing blocks, each suspicious of the other, each less willing to cooperate on issues that demand collective action. The World Trade Organization, once the engine of global economic integration, now struggles to resolve disputes or adapt to modern realities. Trade wars erupt unchecked, supply chains fracture, and protectionism grows. The promise of globalization, that rules would ensure fairness and mutual benefit, has eroded, leaving behind a system vulnerable to unilateralism and coercion. What was meant to be a safeguard has become a casualty of rising nationalism. The hook is stark. Without functioning institutions, global trade and finance do not stabilize societies, they destabilize them, creating volatility that ricochets across borders. All of this comes at the worst possible moment because global challenges do not respect national borders. Climate change, pandemics, terrorism, migration, none of these can be solved by one nation alone. They demand collective mechanisms, shared commitments, and institutions capable of mobilizing resources and enforcing agreements. Yet, just as these crises intensify, the very institutions designed to address them are weakest. The paradox is clear. Never before have we needed strong global cooperation more, and never before have our tools for cooperation been so fragile. This is not simply a technical matter of reforming bureaucracies. It is about whether humanity can act as a community rather than as a collection of tribes. The decline of trust in global institutions mirrors the decline of trust in national institutions. It is part of the same crisis of legitimacy. And when legitimacy erodes, so too does stability. History tells us what happens when institutions collapse. Chaos fills the void and conflict follows. The rules of the game are replaced by the law of the jungle. I told you that if the international order continued to fracture, we would face a world of competing powers, unrestrained by shared norms. And now you can see it in the headlines every day: humanitarian aid blocked, peace negotiations abandoned, trade disputes escalating, climate agreements watered down. The erosion of global institutions is not a distant concern. It is the reality shaping the lives of billions. The question is whether we will allow these structures to crumble completely, or whether we will summon the courage to rebuild them for a new era. The future of global stability depends on that choice, and the urgency could not be greater. We now arrive at the most pivotal truth of all. We are standing at a crossroads, a moment in history that demands a choice. I told you something was coming, and now it is here, not just in the economy, not just in geopolitics, not just in the climate or our institutions, but in the convergence of all these forces pressing down at once. The question before us is not whether the storm has arrived. It has. The question is whether we will meet it with courage and vision, or whether we will allow it to drag us into decline. That choice, my friends, is ours to make, and it will define not just the years ahead, but the very trajectory of this century. The danger of decline is not theoretical. You can already feel it. A society fractured by inequality, poisoned by mistrust, paralyzed by polarization, an international system weakened by rivalry, unable to unite against existential threats, a planet overheating, ecosystems collapsing, millions displaced and desperate. If we continue to drift, if we respond with denial or complacency, decline is not just possible, it is inevitable. That is the hard truth. Decline happens not because societies face challenges, but because they fail to confront them honestly and decisively. Rome did not fall in a single night. It decayed from within, hollowed out by corruption and division. The hook here is clear. A history is filled with civilizations that believed they were immune to collapse right up until the moment they collapsed. But there is another path. Renewal is not only possible, it is within our reach if we choose it. Renewal means investing in people, not just markets. It means placing truth above propaganda, diplomacy above confrontation, sustainability above exploitation. Renewal requires leadership that tells citizens not what they want to hear, but what they need to hear. It requires citizens who refuse to surrender to cynicism and who demand accountability from those in power. Renewal is difficult, yes, but it is also the only path that offers hope, stability, and dignity for generations to come. The choice between decline and renewal is not abstract, it is playing out in real time. Each policy passed, each election held, each international summit convened is a decision point. Do we continue to double down on short-term greed, or do we build systems that can endure? Do we stoke division for political gain, or do we work to rebuild trust across communities and nations? Do we gamble with the climate, or do we finally recognize that our survival depends on urgent action? These choices are not distant. They are here in this moment, demanding answers. The greatest danger we face is not the storm itself, but the temptation to believe we are powerless against it. That sense of helplessness is the seed of decline, the surrender that ensures failure. But history also shows us that moments of great peril can produce extraordinary renewal. After world wars, nations built institutions of peace. After economic collapse, societies rebuilt systems of stability. After injustice, movements rose up to demand equality. The hook is this: renewal has always been possible when people refuse to accept decline as inevitable. I told you something was coming, and now it is here. The storms we face are fierce, but they are not destiny. Destiny will be shaped by the choices we make together, whether we rise to the challenge or shrink from it. whether we act with courage or retreat into fear, whether we embrace the possibility of renewal or resign ourselves to decline, the choice is not for future generations. It is for us here and now. And the eyes of history will look back on this moment and ask, did we recognize the storm for what it was, and did we summon the will to turn crisis into transformation? That, my friends, is the test before us.